So I've had the great opportunity to work with Jill in what we call, this is the Mormon Battalion Association, and creating a repository and research tool, and it's called Kindex. Beginning about a decade ago, Laura Anderson and Terry Leahy, who's also presented yesterday, started in a research project and trying to document early church history research using the Nauvoo land records that they were using, and then they started gathering other resources such as the Camp of Israel documents, and Laura particularly had a dilemma of where to store all of the data that she was gathering that could be searchable. And in attending a conference at Roots Tech, she was exposed to what they called Kindex. And she was looking for some very, very specific things that we could store databases. Kindex was originally a family-centered for family documents and so forth. But she wanted something that was affordable. She wanted something that allowed for side-by-side transcription against the original document, and something that was searchable and easily searchable. And she chose Kindex, which became a database for her next project, the Mormon Battalion Research. And Laura has an extensive, what we call the quilt. It's a big, huge, her treasure trove is actually, and has a lot of different things on all of the battalion members. And one of the challenges we had about the Mormon Battalion members, in past research, they vary of who the men are, what the names are, and who was in the battalion. And sometimes they were misidentified by past researchers as we started to get into it. And our goal over the last 2 years, kind of basically, that we've been working more in depth on it, was to identify the right person with the accurate birth and death dates and track their movements, not only along the trail, as you know, some of them went up into the detachment, some of them were returning back with the Kearney escorts. We were trying to track their movement during their service, but also after discharge. And that's something I'll talk to you about in just a few minutes, that very few people have really got the full picture. And so how do we do that? And we started to look for primary sources. A lot of information that you see people have are secondary, and has created a variety of databases. So the Kindex Project became, her Kindex tool that she was using became very, very important. Laura started looking for many documents that were already on church history that as over time became available to the public. But she was trying to pull everything into one database from that early church history time period. Most of the battalion members obviously were part of that story. And so there was a big effort to start uploading all of those documents into this Kindex repository. We were also looking for many military records. Actually, Laura and Jill went to Washington, D.C. together and discovered a trove of military documents never before seen. We currently have, on the Kindex, 20,000 documents in Kindex database with 34% indexed, but it's a work in progress, and we actually have volunteers. Laura almost every Tuesday is on the internet teaching people how to index these and transcribe these records so that we can search when we're looking. Some of the records that we have, the Nauvoo records, the Camp of Israel records, rebaptism records as they got into Salt Lake City reveal dates, birth dates oftentimes. Besides that, some of the things aren't on Kindex. You just heard Jill describe how her students are doing a lot of detailed research, getting a lot of your original sources for, if there's birth records, census records, so forth. So we're looking at that. We also work very closely with Overland Travel And a lot of times, the Overland Travel Department of the church has additional records. And so we then start comparing. And if you see my spreadsheet, I have dates of birth dates, like sometimes 5, 6, 7, 8 different birth dates, multiple death dates. We're comparing and trying to determine which is an accurate one. But we're looking for christening records, death certificates, by the way, death certificates and obituaries and headstones are not great primary sources for birth dates, so that sometimes causes confusion. But we're also looking in the journals by church authorities that include minutes of leadership in church meetings. Sometimes communication gives us clues. The BY return list, as the battalion members enlisted, Brigham Young and the church, they wanted to know who was in the battalion. So they compiled, it wasn't a military record, it was a list of the men and who they were leaving behind so they could take care of them, or if they were on the trail with them, how many were leaving behind. That list usually has a birth date and where they were born. And that was really helpful, but unfortunately, we only have that for A, B, and E. Companies, there's 5 companies. So C and D, we don't have that. So that was one. Maybe it'll be found one day. But we have soldier journals, we have early church membership records, temple records, your NTR, your National Temple Endowment records that we're able to compare birth and death dates. So we're looking for clues as we're identifying these men. During the winter quarters time period, and so people that maybe not have battalion members inside of Kindex, there's 800 tithing records from the Mid-Missouri River period. There's 1,500 branch records in the general file and 760 in the winter quarters file. Sensitive information has been redacted, but includes birth, marriage, and death records and made available to the public just in the last 5 years. So it's opened up some additional resource tools for us as we search inside of Kindex. There's High Council minutes, 588 for the Potawatomi and another 787 from winter quarters that helps identify where people are during that time period. The Camp of Israel schedules and reports are a rich resource, and actually the Camp of Israel has actually helped us identify some of the men that are the correct men that are in the battalion, because we've been able to combine that and see who's in, where they're at, and identify who they're associating with that helped us identify the correct person with a similar name. In the military records that Jill and Laura discovered, we have original muster rolls, and what you're seeing on this is actually a CMSR record, I think. No, I think this is a pension record. But there's muster-in rolls, clothing rolls, accoutrement rolls, which is their military uniforms, payrolls, detachment rolls, muster, a whole bunch of rolls. And then you have military reports that we have been able to upload on Kindex. Military correspondence, so between General Kearney or Colonel Cook, Lieutenant Smith with orders, Captain Allen. There's a lot of detail in there that we're able to actually helps us tell the story accurately. Some of the past historians, sometimes the little things get a little mixed up, so we're able to identify through some of these. Officers' journals. Military records after discharge, many of you are not aware, the men were eligible for 2 benefits. They got what they called bounty land. Each man serving in the military up until 1855, it's not applicable to the Civil War. They stopped it before then. But all the men in the battalion were eligible for 160 acres of bounty land, and I'll talk about that in a little bit in another slide. But then they also were allowed for pension. And the pension applications have been one of the most interesting things for me personally. I have actually, over the last year, uploaded every single bounty land and pension record onto all the battalion members in Family Search so that family members can see it. As I've read through it, if there's something really unique or something really important, it's up there on their individual Family Search pages. In the pension applications, it identifies typically where they've lived after discharge, so we can follow them, we can track them, where they went after they were discharged. It very often will include who is their children. One of the most comical things that I have come in is you had to identify your legal wife. And because this was polygamy era, very often in the pension records you have multiple wives. You know, they're trying to say, okay, I got divorced here, and then because marriage records were not it was done in the church records, they were having to have somebody within the church verify, or family members that were in attendance, so that you can see what family members actually attended their wedding, sometimes here in Council Bluffs or in Utah. So the pension applications have a lot of fun stories in them that are really pretty fascinating. And even if you have a family member that served in a war earlier that has totally unrelated to the Mormon Battalion, there are pension applications at the National Archives. And they're very valuable document because of the kind of questions that they ask. So I'm going to just show you a little bit of peek at the process. And you can't see, I probably should have made the document bigger, but William B. Gifford was a person that we found that was born on 6th of March, 1827 in Mendon, Monroe, New York. And he's listed with other soldiers in the Company of Ten's list. And we were able to go into Kindex and find Nauvoo, him in Nauvoo records, branch records. The trick with him was very often it was only listed as William Gifford. And unfortunately, William Gifford, here we have a William A. Gifford, and we found him in Family Search. Well, William A. Gifford on his headstone says he's in Company D. Guess what he's in the battalion? Company D. So a family got the two people mixed up. William A. Gifford got put on the Family Search record with the family that's actually not his family, and William B. Gifford was sitting in Family Search all by himself with no one. And so one of our jobs that we've been doing is trying to attach these men to their families, their correct families, and learning more about him. And William A. Gifford is actually in the Civil War, not the Mexican-American War, but it's kind of interesting for that. I forget what record that's showing up in the Civil War. It's not a pension record, but there's something that identified him on a roll, if I remember correctly. So we were able to literally get those through records that we were finding in Kindex. We were able to piece the whole story together. We knew his middle initial was B, and this is a compiled service military record that at one point in time, Washington, D.C. did not want everybody handling the original records. So staff literally went through all the rolls and so forth and started listing all the different records that they had on a single index card. And so it would list what was on the original roll. And so we can see it on the original roll, but in this instance, I just put for you to see the compiled military service record, and there is the initial B in that. We were able to start to verify we had the right guy. He is with the Brown Sick Detachment as he comes in, coming in to Utah, and then leaving he goes from Santa Fe to Pueblo, and then into Salt Lake in July. He is rebaptized in Salt Lake, so we were able to pick up that document to know. And on some of these, he was still listed as William Gifford, and you had to sit there and say, okay, do we have the right person? So then, when he was going back to Council Bluffs, and I want to just pause for a moment on this, is something really important that we have discovered. Not a lot of people, including Overland Travel. Overland Travel documents people coming in from outside of Utah into Utah. They don't document people going back. After they arrived here in the Salt Lake Valley, the battalion members many of them were going back to Council Bluffs, and many of the Vanguard Company went back. You've heard a couple of different times over the last 2 days that they refer to 30 or 32 men that go back to Council Bluffs. Well, actually, there's that first year, got to get my number up here. There is 139 to 154 men that go back that first year. So you have Kearney's escorts, you have 15 of them going back to Council Bluffs. 13 of them get there, 2 join up with the early companies and come into Salt Lake. You have another group, and they arrive in August. You have another group that arrive back into here in Council Bluffs. They're coming from the detachments groups. And then you have another group of men coming from California into Salt Lake. So as the men started to come back to Salt Lake, they're met by James Brown and telling the man, this is big Hancock, Hunt, Little, Pace, Little, HAPL, I think we abbreviate it for. They're on their way back to Salt Lake to meet their families to the Great Basin, and they are met by James Brown. And James Brown says, if you don't have the supplies, you need to go back. Don't come forward. And so there's kind of around 200 of the men that are coming back, and half of them continue to Salt Lake. The other half go back to Sutter's. And so that group coming to Salt Lake, the one document that people often refer to of these 32 men it's the PACE, it's a portion of the group that come back to Salt Lake that they've documented diaries. Well, we found out that there's a whole lot more than that, another 30 or so people that go back to Council Bluffs from that group. So you have a large number, and there is actually, we found a document, William Butt is a bounty land agent in Missouri, and he actually says in a letter that we found on Kindex that we'd had uploaded that there were about 150 men from the battalion floating around by, he says, November 1846, there's 47. It's actually, as we found it, because that last group coming from California, they arrive in December, just before Christmas. So by Christmas, there's around 150 battalion members that are back there to pick up their families. So that particular document that you're seeing up there is actually one of the groups that goes back with Brigham Young. There's 2 companies, and they arrive in Council Bluffs in the October time period. But William Gifford is on that. So as he gets back there, then he eventually, we go, okay, where can we find out where he went, what happened to him? So we start looking at census records. Well, lo and behold, we discover William B. Gifford in California, 2 different census records, one in 1850, and in the 1852 census, he's there with another battalion member. Actually, I think it's the 51 he's with the battalion member, and the 52 one he's with, he's lists on the census record that he was a resident of Hancock County, Illinois, and it does have that B initial, that William B. Gifford. So slowly we started to put his story together. We still don't know where he's died. This whole project is an ongoing process. It's going to take us a long time. So we know he's, we actually found his brother, and this was the other thing, how we hooked him into his family. His brother Levi does temple work for him in the St. George Temple, and says he's died, and he's at that time in 1883, we know he's died before then because his brother does his temple work for him, seals him to his family. So that helped us put his story together and identified that one particular person. In 1849, this is a very interesting about bounty land, and this is something that I've discovered, and I've actually created a spreadsheet of everybody that I knew went back to Council Bluffs, and then started comparing the records of the bounty land documents. And this is actually William B. Gifford, and he lists his middle initial of B in the bounty land application. However, I've put up here, use bounty land applications with extra caution, because in my studies of all the bounty land, I started noticing that there were men that couldn't have been in Iowa. They were still in California. And then you started finding bounty land applications where the men themselves said they are applying for bounty land in 1852 in California and say, hey, wait a minute. They get a notice and from the land application, well, you already had a bounty land that was issued and sold. And so they're declaring fraud. So you've all of a sudden got this little fraud issue. This particular one is signed as witnesses James E. Hirons and Clark Stillman. We know Clark Stillman was there. He was in the area. James D. Hirons, we're not so sure. We're having troubles identifying and verifying if he was actually. We don't think he was. And we do know that William B. Gifford was there, but whether they signed it or not, it's uncertain. It was his bounty land. So what happens? They get their bounty land, they supply, they get a warrant. It's a paper. Then they sell the warrant. Most of the battalion men sold their warrants because you could get a bounty land of 160 acres, or in lieu of bounty land, you could get a $100 scrip. They could sell the land for more money than $100. It was typically going around 125 as far as I can tell. So many of the men were selling their warrants to somebody else, and then at one point the men would go into the land office, which was actually in Atchison, Missouri. That was where the land office, they'd take their paperwork there and then claim their land wherever federal land was available. It was not available in Utah at that point. Utah wasn't even federal land yet, but so they were selling. The question that we've had, and we don't have an answer for, there were a lot of men that were not present. We don't know. Some of the bounty land are signed by military officers. We don't know if the military officers were just trying to capture, apply for the men that they knew weren't going to be there and try to get the money to them, or if you get really a few agents. Bounty land agents at that time were really aggressive. We actually have a bounty land agents called Middleton and Bill. We found a document in the Kindex that was submitted by Ammon Babbitt with 82 names of men that had their bounty land turned in by Middleton and Bill. And he's caveat, he uses the word caveat, which he's in legal terms, it's a formal request to challenge the validity of those documents. So we don't know exactly what happened with those, but we do think that particular one of Middleton and Bill, actually, they all got sold. Somebody benefited from that. We don't know if it was the agent. We don't know if the church might have been trying to process and get money to the families and help move the families west. There's a lot of, we really don't know what happened. We plan to go back and see if we can look on the back side of the warrants to get a clue back in Washington, D.C., if there's the land, because we can see the actual documents in the cell. We can actually see the cell of it. Well, who gets the land. But we don't know if on the backside, we've seen a few that we can actually see the process of that changing. So just be careful if you have family members, just be careful. If you're looking at bounty land documents, as far as the Mormon Battalion story, there are some questions on that, but for the most part, most of the men got their bounty land, and it was a blessing to them. Well, there's a few people that actually got land, but the majority of them sold it and had their money to help them buy supplies. So, in conclusion, we're still looking for clarity on some men. We've only got 4 men that we have no clue who they are, which is pretty amazing for 496 men. And just as a side note, just so you realize, the original muster rolls that are dated July 16th, it's got 496 men. But some of those men's names are crossed out, replaced. But by the first payroll on August 31st, there's 496 men, but they're not the same men. They're different men. So the rolls were very fluid for that first while. You had more people coming in at Fort Leavenworth, a small number, but we're still tracking these other men, what happened to them. Many of them had other assignments in the church. So that's a pretty interesting story. If you want to go on our Mormon Battalion website, I have up there mormonbattalion.org. There's a thing you can watch called Correcting the Record, and it kind of talks through some of the issues and how that fluidity of the roles occurred, and and the challenges that past researchers had that didn't have as many records as we have of identifying who were the correct men. So we do have an ongoing project, the Kindex Project, where we're transcribing. If you're interested in transcribing, you can contact Laura. I've put up her email up there. You can also, if you're wanting to do more research and want to access the records and get into it, because Kindex at the moment is, you can identify it's private, which ours is identified at the moment. They are looking at getting a search tool. Kindex right now is in the process of changing a little bit so they can get access to the information that we're using to help identify these men. And as a final thing, if any of you in here say you don't have Mormon Battalion family members and you have one pioneer ancestor, just go to relativefinder.org and you're going to find out you're probably related to 200 and 300 of them. If you're related to 1 or 2 pioneers, they're connected, I almost guarantee it, 95% of the time to a bunch of battalion members that you don't realize that you're related to. Thank you.
Okay, one quick correction. My email address is pathfanatic, path being the original genealogy tool. I'm not a puff fanatic, I'm a path fanatic. So, and it's pathfanatic10, PAFFANATIC, number 10 at yahoo.com. We've got about 3 or 4 minutes for questions. Are there any? None? Don't be shy. So I want to see by a show of hands, how many people here have battalion members in their family? Okay, how many people here have people in Nauvoo in their family? Okay, so most of us. The records that we are indexing in Kindex have to do with early church history, because there's no way to take early church history and separate it from the Mormon Battalion. If we're going to research on 500 of the early saints and their families, we have to research on all early church history documents. So if you're interested, let me know and we can get you on. Eventually it will be Google searchable, so everyone will be able to find it when they go looking for their families. So have a few-minute break and we will see you for our next session.